Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'd start out with a bit of a story. In 1985, a 9-year-old boy named Kevin is diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, a chronic autoimmune disorder that causes pain and inflammation in the joints, usually in the smaller joints, but in Kevin's case, it was his hips. By senior year in high school, Kevin had had both hips replaced and had developed an addiction to fentanyl. By 21, Kevin's parents had cut off all ties with him. And on Kevin's 22nd birthday, homeless, broke, and alone, Kevin overdosed on heroin. If you're like me, if you're like most people, you might read in the paper or online that a 22-year-old has overdosed and think to yourself that such a tragic thing could never happen to people I love. Certainly not our families. The American dream is a distant one for hundreds of thousands of Americans, hundreds of thousands of our brothers and sisters who don't have a place they can call home, no place to sleep tonight. Without a permanent roof over their heads, unhoused people seek refuge in shelters. Some do. Others spend their nights in public places that are unfit to sleep in. Imagine how it would feel not to have a home to go to tonight, or to have a bed to call your own, no place to store your belongings. Imagine not having enough money in your pocket to buy something to eat. Imagine how you'd feel knowing that you have family members that will not talk to you, let alone help you. There was a time not so long ago when I could not imagine these things. In full disclosure, friends, it wasn't until I began my first parish ministry in Fayetteville, Arkansas in my early 40s that I began seeing unhoused people first and foremost as human beings, and their being unhoused as a terrible, terrible situation, and hopefully a temporary one. Until I began volunteering at a soup kitchen in Fayetteville, Arkansas in 2004, without even realizing it, over time, I had come to embrace the appalling idea that somehow homelessness was a person's fault. A series of bad choices, a lack of intelligence or motivation, that somehow they had brought this on themselves. I hear myself admit this to you, and part of me wants to just crawl under a rock. There I was. I had just graduated from divinity school, passed my boards with high marks, was ordained by a loving congregation, and had found my first parish ministry. And still, there was so little room in my heart for homeless people. It was in that Arkansas soup kitchen that my heart finally started breaking open a little. Over time and in conversation with many guests at the soup kitchen, I started seeing how much more alike we are than different. It was the first time I understood that no one chooses to be homeless. I learned about how sibling rivalry had forced Cheryl to give up living in her family home after her mom had died. I learned that a car accident had shattered Romy's right leg so badly that he lost his job, and things spun out of control so quickly he was on the street before he even realized what had happened. I learned that sleeping out in the rough could be frightening, especially for women, but that for some, that was still a better option than the drug trafficking at the shelter on the other side of town. Lately, I've been pondering the idea that despite the high value many of us place on diversity, we live in a society that places an even higher value on conformity and playing by the rules. But isn't it in that very social conditioning, that wanting to fit in, that enables us to see unhoused people, people who don't or can't or simply won't conform, as other, as somehow undeserving? Think about it. From a very young age, we are subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, taught the right way to behave, the right way to dress, to work, even to think. This social conditioning creates a framework of what's considered normal, what's considered acceptable. And when someone falls outside this framework, whether by choice or circumstance, it can trigger a sense of otherness in those of us who adhere to those norms. And when falling outside that framework results in someone becoming homeless, their very presence often exemplifies that stark departure from the expected norms of housing, employment, and social participation. It's almost as if our desire for social cohesion, which is understandable, can inadvertently create these boundaries and hierarchies, who's in, who's out. The drive to fit in can make it difficult to truly empathize with those whose lives look drastically different from our own. And therein lies the rub. How can we genuinely embrace diversity if our underlying social structures and conditioning prioritize conformity? It forces us to examine our own biases and the ways in which we might unconsciously perpetuate these divisions. Perhaps, recognizing this dynamic could be a first step toward fostering a more inclusive and compassionate society. Our scripture this morning, which addresses poverty and hunger and homelessness, is a text from the Hebrew Bible, the book of Isaiah, which predates the arrival of Jesus by about 500 years. Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? By some estimates, there are more than 160 passages in the Old Testament demanding kindness and generosity to the poor. And the New Testament over and over emphasizes the importance of caring for the poor and the needy. It calls for generosity and compassion and action to alleviate suffering and promote justice. And here we are, after 2,500 years, still needing to hear those same exhortations. But when we look at another and see the holy within them, rather than just what's wrong or what's different, it can transform us both. The miracle, you might say, happens when we can look into another's eyes and glimpse God's love, recognize our spiritual kinship. Jesus once said, "Whatever you do to the least of these, you do to me." It's the same story. When we see our unhoused sisters and brothers as other, we betray the fact that our religious vision cannot see beyond our own kind of people. But when we treat homeless people as the children of God they truly are, and allow ourselves to feel the connection to them, we may realize that, my God, we're all in this together. In my work with Chaplains on the Way, every day I'm reminded that unhoused people want to be recognized, want to receive your smile more than almost anything, almost more than food. Our unhoused guests wish someone would meet their eyes, smile, and say hello. When that can happen at a very human level, they suddenly become real people. People who bleed when they're cut, shiver when they're cold, cry salty tears, and hurt so deeply when they are sloughed off as though they weren't people at all, but only objects cluttering up our sidewalks. What would happen to us, I wonder? What would happen to our society if we stopped seeing unhoused people as problems and began seeing them as the children of God most of us like to think we are? What kinds of laws would we then fight to change? What kind of safety nets would we then work to create? Even the most fortunate of us is little more than one serious brain injury or a few financial disasters away from the street. We don't think it could happen to us, but once they didn't think it could happen to them. What happens to us when we stop seeing these poor, hungry, and homeless people as objects and see them as our brothers and sisters? Something in us looks into them. Something in them looks into us. And we say, hello, I recognize you. You're like me. I know your hopes, your dreams. I know your fears because I have them too. One thing I'm sure of is that once we see how much more alike we are, how much we really are all God's children, that it can change our world. Then the homeless are no longer the problem. They are the essence. We know then that our souls come from the same stuff, are woven from the same fabric of hopes, yearnings, and fears. That we are all trying to find our way home. In a spiritual sense, we become homeless together, as children alone in a world with only ourselves and one another to rely on. And God, of course. You may wonder how that could really change the world. The truth is that it's just about the only thing that can or ever will. I began this morning telling you about a boy named Kevin who overdosed when he was 22. Kevin did overdose, but he did not die. And during his recovery, he met Reverend Becky at Chaplains on the Way. And over time, and with help and encouragement, Kevin jump-started his life. Some of you may know Kevin as KJ, the sexton at First Parish in Waltham, where the breakfast program takes place. KJ's life is far from easy, but friends, it's far from over. He may be in recovery, but he's also a son and a brother and an uncle and a co-worker and my friend. Chaplains on the Way was a lifesaver for Kevin, and it is for many of the guests we greet each morning. But please remember that it is only because of you and other generous donors and dedicated volunteers that Chaplains on the Way exists at all. Volunteering to help serve breakfast may not sound all that glamorous, and frankly, it isn't. But the work, the experience of serving food, sharing smiles and conversation with our unhoused neighbors can and will transform us. If you'd like to learn more about Chaplains on the Way and the breakfast program, I and perhaps a few other volunteers from the program who've joined us this morning will be happy to talk following the service. Thank you, and blessed be.